Hey everybody, it's Jason Blaha here, and today I want to chat with you guys a little bit about something I've covered a few times in the past, but it's still something that comes up a lot, and I even get it with new clients sometimes who will ask things like, why is my deadlift so much higher than my squat? And generally speaking, it's usually a case of you just don't have enough muscle in your lower body. That's usually the cause. In other words, if you have a very strong upper and middle back, you can compensate, right? You can compensate and actually have a respectable deadlift. Not saying it'll be a great deadlift, but you can have a respectable deadlift, up over 400 pounds while having no legs, right? You can have chicken legs and still do that if your back is strong. So if you've done a lot of pull-ups or rows and chin-ups and lat pull-downs and you've built your whole back and you've got some decent traps and shoulders and everything, you can usually deadlift a decent amount, right? A decent amount. You may not be pulling 600, but you'll pull a decent amount and you might have a really weak squat. Now, conversely, what I'll also see is guys who do not have a strong posterior chain, who maybe have lats and a back and traps, and they've got quads who it's still lagging, and they've got an okay squat, but they squat with a very narrow stance. Well, in that case, it's because they're quad dominant and they're doing a quad dominant type squat, and you're just going to move less weight that way. And when I say quad dominant, it doesn't mean that other types of squatting doesn't use the quads as much as that, but it means is that it brings other muscles into play. And so if you have a fairly weak posterior chain and you continue to narrow stance squat, what happens? Well, you're going to continue to be anterior dominant and you're going to have to squat that way. So I can tell you one of the best ways to tell right up front if that's your case is if you take your stance out wider and you're not as strong. Because technically you've brought more muscles into play. So if you take a wider stance on your squat and you're not stronger at it, that means that you have some major weaknesses in things like your hips, glutes, etc. Right? That means that they are a major weak link for you, because by adding them to it, you're still not any stronger. And you're now at a mechanical situation where you're not used to the movement patterns. You're not used to it, so you're now at a disadvantage, and you haven't gained anything because those muscles are so weak that they're not really contributing to moving more weight. Because under normal circumstances, when we bring more muscles into play, we can move a bigger weight. So that's usually what's going on there, as far as if you seem to have some quad, but you have a much stronger deadlift than a squat, it's because you still have a strong back. So what we generally see, the longer you've been training, is that we see the gap close between the two. And you also will notice that as body weight goes up. And this can be noticed very heavily in powerlifting. Go look at the trends in powerlifting. Lighter weight classes, what do we see? We see guys whose deadlift is oftentimes significantly higher than their squat. Okay? And I mean more than a 20% disparity. More than a 20% disparity. So in other words, if you deadlift 500 plus, but you only squat 400, like, it's not uncommon to see that in a lighter weight class. Okay, it's not uncommon to see that for a guy who weighs 165 pounds, 170 pounds, right? For them to, deadlift 502, 510 and barely squat 400, right? We see that. And it has to do with the fact that body weight correlates more to the squat than it does the deadlift. And not just body weight in terms of muscle mass, but body weight in terms of fat mass. Because this is something I saw in my comments, someone trying to claim, well, if a guy has a big deadlift, he just could be a fat powerlifter. Well, that's not actually true. Usually your fat powerlifters don't have that great of deadlifts. Meaning, okay, let me put it this way. Some of them might have a good deadlift. They might have a good deadlift, but there will be guys in lighter weight classes who out deadlift them by 100 pounds. That's what I mean by not as good. In other words, you'll see guys who weigh 300 plus pounds who barely deadlift 700. Okay? But there are guys out there in lighter weight classes who deadlift 800. And there's quite a few of them. And the reason for that is because body fat actually makes your deadlift harder, particularly central adiposity. So if you have a belly, it's harder for you to deadlift. And that's why it's so impressive when you see guys like Thor who pulled the weight that he pulled using terrible deadlift mechanics. Okay, that's actually a testament to how strong that guy is to deadlift over 500 kilos with a belly and using fat boy deadlift style. People say, what do you mean? That wide stance with a wide grip. Okay, that makes the lift harder. I want to make that very, very clear. Biomechanically, it is more difficult to pull every single pound or kilo that you put on the bar in that position. However, it has to be done when you've got a belly because you have to get that belly between your thighs. All right, so look at the difference here. See me doing a deficit deadlift with a narrow stance? Because I don't have a belly, I'm able to get away with that. Doesn't mean I don't have body fat, doesn't mean I'm ripped, because I'm not. But I don't have an actual belly. I don't have a belly that has to fit between my thighs. Okay, when you have a belly that gets in the way and it makes it hard for you to bend down with a narrow stance, you have to take your stance out wider. And if you take your stance out wider, your grip has to go out wider. And when your grip goes wider, what happens? We increase the range of motion out of the bottom. It makes the lift harder. Okay? Now, it's not to say that a wider stance itself doesn't help you. The stance can be fine. The stance can be beneficial for moving more weight. But the grip counteracts it and makes it even more difficult. The negatives of the wider grip offset it. They offset the benefits and push it in the other direction. So if you're so fat that you have to take a wider stance to deadlift, we can call that fat boy deadlift, you're going to move less weight. So what we find in general is that gains in body fat don't usually help your deadlift. They don't generally help your deadlift. If you gain a bunch of weight and it happens to be body fat, and let's say 2/3 of the weight you gain is body fat and 1/3 of it's muscle, you may not see your deadlift go up significantly. But come back over and look at the squat. What happens to the squat? All weight gain helps your squat. The squat is more muscle mass dependent. The deadlift tends to be specific to finding your weak links. And if you have any really strong muscles on the deadlift, any of the major movers, they'll compensate quite a bit. So a guy who has really jacked hamstrings and glutes and hips can usually still deadlift a lot even if his back is lacking, his upper back and everything, and mid back. He can usually deadlift a lot. It just won't be the best he should be able to do. And the same thing if your upper body is jacked, particularly your whole back, you'll still be able to deadlift a lot usually even if you have weak legs. In a perfect world, both are strong. But what we tend to find is that weight gain in general and muscle gain is beneficial to the squat. It's more muscle mass oriented. It's more correlated with body weight. Also, body fat can help your squat. Not as much as muscle does. Okay, 10 pounds of muscle will put a lot more onto your squat than 10 pounds of fat will. But that extra padding, the same thing that hurts you on the deadlift, can help you out of the bottom of a squat. So a guy who has a little bit of belly that presses against the top of his thighs at the bottom of a squat, it gives him a cushion to rebound. So body weight in general will bridge the gap because a belly, particularly body fat, will make your squat go easier and it'll make your deadlift harder. Okay, it'll make your deadlift harder. But in general, muscle increases both of them. If you gain muscle mass, your squat and deadlift go up, particularly through your back and your lower body, obviously. They make both go up. But what you find is that your squat doesn't go up in the same proportion as your deadlift. In other words, if you gain 10 pounds of muscle mass, your squat will probably go up more than your deadlift will. So for guys who are early on who have a very strong deadlift versus squat, you probably just have decent leverages for the deadlift, and it's very common to see that. But as you gain more muscle, every pound of muscle that you gain is going to add less to your deadlift than it adds to your squat. So as you get thicker and more jacked and you get more training experience and more muscle mass, the gap between the two tends to get smaller and smaller and smaller. And as you gain body weight, As you gain body weight, they usually end up equaling each other. So if you gain fat and muscle, so the guys who aren't particularly lean in some of the heavier weight classes, what you're going to find is that your squat will usually catch your deadlift unless you're just really, really built to deadlift with long arms and things. It'll usually catch it. And in the cases of the heavier weight classes where the guys have a fair amount of body fat oftentimes, sometimes their squat will pass their deadlift. And that's due to the leverage changes due to the body fat. So these are guys who have a tremendous amount of muscle and carry a lot of fluff. Okay, in that case, you oftentimes see that happen to where their squat is sometimes now higher than their deadlift by a small amount. And that's due to the body fat itself, creating that disparity. All right, guys, well, that's really all I have to say on that today. I hope it's been informative, and I will talk to you guys next time.